She was just 18, a high school senior in a small Florida town. To everyone around her, she was bright, ambitious, and full of potential. But in the shadows of her life lay a secret, a horrifying truth that no one suspected. 16 men, trusted by her own father, had stolen her innocence. Then she found out something that would change everything. She was living with HIV. What happened next was beyond anyone's imagination. She didn't stay silent. She didn't turn away. She chose a path that no one could have predicted. 16 men, one plan, and a community forever shaken. Her name was Kayla Johnson, an 18-year-old high school senior living in what appeared to be an ordinary Florida town. Kayla was the kind of girl you'd notice in the hallways, sharp, driven, and always with a bright smile. Her teachers often praised her as one of the most promising students in her class, and she dreamed of becoming a lawyer one day, determined to make a difference in the world. Kayla was raised in a close-knit American family, deeply rooted in their community. Her father, Robert Johnson, was well known, a hard-working man who had built a reputation as someone reliable and dependable. His circle of friends, men he'd grown up with or met through work, were often around the house, attending barbecues, watching football games, or simply stopping by for a drink. To Kayla, these men were familiar faces. Uncles, in a way, figures she had grown up seeing, men she thought she could trust. She would often hear their laughter echoing from the backyard and see them patting her father on the back, sharing jokes and reminiscing about old times. Kayla's life was busy but fulfilling. She was involved in her school's debate team, excelled in her classes, and was even working on applications to top universities. She had a small circle of close friends, and they often spent weekends together, dreaming about their futures and planning for graduation. Her friends would always say, "Kayla's going places." And it seemed like she was. But as Kayla's bright future seemed within reach, cracks in her world began to form. Cracks that only she could see. Her father's friends, once warm and friendly, began to act differently toward her. She noticed the lingering stares, the inappropriate comments disguised as jokes. It started small, subtle enough to be dismissed, but over time their behavior escalated, and what had once been harmless family gatherings became something far more threatening. Kayla felt trapped. These were her father's closest friends, men he trusted implicitly. How could she tell him what was happening? How could she put into words the fear and unease that gripped her every time one of them came too close or spoke to her in a way that made her skin crawl? And so she stayed silent, burying her feelings beneath her schoolwork and her dreams of escape. But the weight of their actions began to take its toll. Kayla's once vibrant personality began to dim. Her friends noticed she was quieter, more withdrawn. Her teachers remarked that she seemed distracted. What no one could have known was that this silence would eventually be broken. Kayla would take matters into her own hands, and the consequences would ripple far beyond anything anyone could have imagined. Her story is one of betrayal and unimaginable pain, but it's also a story of a young girl's desperate attempt to reclaim control of her life. This is where her journey truly begins. Before we continue this gripping tale, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell. Your support means the world to us and allows us to bring you more stories like this one. Subscribe now so you don't miss out on the unfolding drama and the powerful lessons it holds. Thank you for being part of our community. Now, let's dive back into the story. For years, Kayla trusted the men who frequented her home. They were her father's closest friends, men she had seen at family gatherings, celebrated holidays with, and grown to see as extended family. But that trust would be exploited in ways she never could have imagined. It started with seemingly innocent interactions. They would compliment her, comments on how much she had grown, how beautiful she was becoming. At first, she thought nothing of it. But the comments became more frequent, more personal, and eventually more unsettling. Then there were the moments when she found herself alone with one of them. A moment in the kitchen, a ride home after school, or even an evening when they stayed late after her father had gone to bed. These moments were orchestrated, deliberate, and always left her feeling uneasy. She could sense the shift in their tone, the way their eyes lingered, the way they leaned in just a little too close. Kayla began to feel trapped in her own home. These weren't strangers she could avoid. They were men her father trusted, men he considered family. And so she said nothing, fearing that speaking up would cause tension or, worse, disbelief. The manipulation grew more calculated. They preyed on her naivety and her fear of upsetting her father. Sometimes they would subtly guilt her into compliance, reminding her how much they had done for her family. Other times they would dismiss her discomfort, brushing it off as a misunderstanding or an overreaction. This left Kayla questioning her own feelings, wondering if she was imagining the danger. The emotional toll was immense. She felt isolated, unable to confide in her friends or family. The once vibrant and confident teenager began to withdraw from those around her. She avoided gatherings, kept to herself, and even considered leaving home earlier than planned to escape the suffocating environment. Kayla's silence wasn't a choice. It was a survival mechanism. She carried the weight of their actions alone, unsure of who to trust or where to turn for help. Each day she wrestled with shame, anger, and confusion, trying to make sense of why the people she had once seen as protectors had turned into predators. Experts often refer to this kind of betrayal as a form of psychological imprisonment, explains Dr. Linda Reyes, a clinical psychologist specializing in trauma. When trust is broken by someone in a position of power, it leaves the victim questioning their own reality, their own worth. It's a devastating cycle. The community too seemed oblivious. Many of these men were respected, their actions hidden behind closed doors. To the outside world, they were hard-working and loyal friends, but to Kayla, they were the source of her growing fear and despair. She became a prisoner in her own life, haunted by the actions of those who should have been her protectors. And yet, even in her darkest moments, there was a part of Kayla that held on to the hope that she could one day escape. That hope would soon be eclipsed by anger, a deep, burning anger that would drive her to make a decision that no one could have foreseen. It was a decision born of desperation, a response to years of betrayal and isolation, and it would change everything. Kayla's life, already shadowed by betrayal, was about to take an even darker turn. It began with a routine school health checkup, just another box to tick before graduation. But the results she received weren't routine at all. They were life-altering. The nurse's voice trembled as she explained the findings. "Kayla, your blood test came back positive for HIV." Those words hit her like a freight train, knocking the breath from her lungs. For a moment she couldn't comprehend what she was hearing. How could this happen? She was only 18, barely stepping into adulthood, and now she was faced with a diagnosis that would change the course of her life forever. At first there was disbelief. She replayed every interaction, every moment, searching for an answer. And then, like a wave crashing over her, the realization struck. It wasn't just the diagnosis. It was where it had come from. The men who had taken advantage of her had left her with this devastating, permanent mark. The emotions came in waves. First, there was the overwhelming sadness. Kayla grieved for the life she thought she would have, the dreams of college, a career, a family. Those dreams now seemed impossibly far away. Then came the anger. It wasn't just anger at the men who had betrayed her, but at the world that had allowed it to happen. Why hadn't anyone protected her? Why hadn't anyone noticed her pain? Perhaps the most suffocating feeling of all was the shame. In her community, the stigma surrounding HIV was pervasive. It was seen as a mark of irresponsibility, a sign of something shameful. Kayla feared that if anyone found out, She would be ostracized, judged. She withdrew further, sinking into a deep isolation. The once vibrant girl who had dreamed of becoming a lawyer now spent her days staring blankly at her bedroom walls, consumed by despair. But as the days turned into weeks, something within her began to shift. The despair that had paralyzed her began to transform into something else. Something stronger. Emma realized she couldn't change what had happened to her. The damage was done. But she could do something about the men who had caused it. She couldn't let them continue to live their lives unscathed while she bore the weight of their actions. And so she made a decision. One that would change the lives of everyone involved. She wouldn't succumb to despair. She wouldn't stay silent. Kayla was going to take justice into her own hands. And her plan? It would shock the world. No one could have predicted what was coming next. Not the men who had wronged her, not her father, and certainly not the quiet Florida community where she lived. But Kayla wasn't thinking about them anymore. She was thinking about reclaiming her power in the only way she knew how. This was the moment everything changed. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about revenge. Kayla's decision was not impulsive. It was a calculated, deliberate plan that she carefully crafted over weeks. Each step was planned with precision, and her targets were clear. The 16 men who had betrayed her trust and shattered her life. In her mind, they were the reason she was now living with HIV, and she was determined to make them face the same reality. She started by revisiting the places where these men frequented. Bars, community events, and even her own home during gatherings hosted by her father. Kayla was careful not to arouse suspicion. She remained polite, approachable, and even friendly, all while masking the storm of emotions churning beneath the surface. Her strategy was simple yet chillingly effective. She would engage each man in private, often under the guise of needing advice or confiding in them. Kayla knew their weaknesses, their habits, and their egos, and she used that knowledge to her advantage. Many of them believed she was seeking comfort, someone to lean on, a vulnerability they had exploited before. What they didn't know was that this time, Kayla was in control. Her methods were methodical. She ensured that each encounter left no room for them to suspect her true intentions. She would manipulate the situation to make it seem consensual, a willing act that left no trace of her hidden motives. To the men, it was just another instance of them exerting their power over her, but to Kayla, it was an act of retribution. As each man unknowingly fell victim to her plan, Kayla began to feel a sense of power she hadn't felt in years. For once, she was no longer the helpless victim, she was the one orchestrating their downfall. But as her plan unfolded, the emotional toll began to weigh heavily on her. She wasn't blind to the moral complexities of her actions. Kayla knew what she was doing was wrong, that her revenge came at a cost, not just to the men, but to herself. Each act was a reminder of the pain they had caused her, but it also deepened her own internal conflict. Was this justice, or was it vengeance? And at what point did the lines blur between the two? This question is one that has haunted both victims and perpetrators in stories like Kayla's, says Dr. Linda Reyes, a clinical psychologist. It's the ultimate ethical dilemma. When someone takes justice into their own hands, are they truly seeking reparation, or are they perpetuating the cycle of harm? As the weeks went by, the men began to show signs of concern. Unusual health issues started to arise, though none of them suspected Kayla. To them, she was still the quiet, obedient girl they had once manipulated. But Kayla knew it was only a matter of time before the pieces began to fall into place. Her actions left behind a community that would soon be forced to confront the darkness hidden in its corners. But Kayla's plan wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming the power that had been stolen from her. In her mind, she was balancing the scales, ensuring that the men who had taken everything from her would never be able to hurt anyone else. Was Kayla justified? Or had her pain driven her to become something she had fought so hard to resist? These are the questions that would linger long after her story came to light. Questions that force us to grapple with the blurred lines between justice and vengeance. For weeks, life in the quiet Florida community continued as usual, but beneath the surface, whispers of something unusual began to spread. Several men, respected members of the neighborhood, were falling mysteriously ill. Symptoms that they couldn't explain led them to seek medical help, and it wasn't long before the diagnosis began to emerge. HIV. At first there was confusion. How could this be happening to men with no known history of risky behavior? The connection between them wasn't immediately apparent, but the growing number of cases began to raise red flags for local health officials. Patterns emerged as the same names were reported to clinics and hospitals. Behind closed doors, suspicions grew, and questions arose. Was there a common link between these men? It wasn't until one of the men, during a routine questioning by his physician, mentioned Kayla's name that the puzzle began to fit together. This sparked a broader investigation. Law enforcement, working closely with public health authorities, started tracing the interactions and relationships between the infected individuals. Detective Charles Ramirez, who led the investigation, later explained, "It was like unraveling a web. Once we started connecting the dots, her name came up over and over again. It became impossible to ignore." When officers approached Kayla, she remained calm but guarded. At first, she denied any involvement, but as evidence mounted against her, phone records, witness statements, and even confessions from some of the men, her carefully constructed facade began to crack. Finally, faced with overwhelming proof, Kayla confessed. News of her arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Headlines splashed across newspapers and TV screens. 18-year-old high school girl arrested in connection with HIV transmission to 16 men. The story quickly became a media sensation, with opinions sharply divided. Some saw Kayla as a victim, pushed to the brink, a young girl whose tragic circumstances had driven her to take desperate measures. Others painted her as a calculated and vengeful predator, someone who had used her diagnosis as a weapon. Social media erupted with debates, hashtags and viral threads, dissecting every detail of the case. At her arraignment, Kayla appeared stoic, her expression unreadable. Prosecutors charged her with multiple counts, including intentional transmission of HIV and aggravated assault. The defense, however, argued that Kayla's actions were the result of severe trauma and psychological damage caused by years of abuse. During the trial, the victims took the stand, their testimonies revealing a mixture of anger, regret, and disbelief. Some admitted to their own role in what had happened, acknowledging their betrayal of trust. Others placed full blame on Kayla, insisting they had been deceived. The courtroom became a battleground of ethics and emotions. Prosecutors highlighted the calculated nature of Kayla's actions, presenting her as someone who had knowingly endangered lives. The defense countered with a powerful narrative of abuse, betrayal, and a young girl's desperate attempt to reclaim power in an unfair world. The trial captivated the nation, raising difficult questions about morality, accountability, and the consequences of unchecked abuse. As the jury deliberated, the world watched, waiting for a verdict that would determine not only Kayla's fate, but also how society would remember her story. What was clear, however, was that Kayla's story was far from black and white. It was a complex, painful tale of betrayal, revenge, and the human capacity to endure unimaginable circumstances. And no matter the outcome, her actions had left a community forever changed. The verdict was delivered, and the chapter of Kayla Johnson's trial came to a close. But her story left behind a ripple effect that extended far beyond the courtroom. Across the nation, people were forced to confront uncomfortable truths, not only about the stigma surrounding HIV, but also about the devastating impact of abuse and betrayal within trusted relationships. Kayla's case ignited conversations about the importance of HIV awareness and education. For many, Her story was a wake-up call to the realities of how stigma and misinformation could drive individuals into isolation and despair. Public health advocates seized the opportunity to push for greater access to testing, treatment, and support for those living with HIV. Dr. Linda Reyes, a psychologist who had followed the case closely, remarked, "This tragedy underscores the importance of addressing trauma early and providing victims with safe spaces to come forward. Without proper intervention, pain can manifest in destructive ways, as we've seen here." Community leaders in Kayla's hometown also spoke out about the need to rebuild trust and accountability. The case shed light on the dangers of abuse of power, particularly when perpetrators operate within the boundaries of close-knit relationships. Pastor James Harris, a prominent figure in the community, said in an interview, "We failed Kayla. We failed to protect her from harm, and we failed to see the signs. This must be a lesson to us all, to never ignore the silent cries of those around us." But as society began to dissect the layers of her story, one question remained. What do we make of Kayla's actions? Was this an act of justice, a desperate attempt to reclaim her power, or the beginning of a larger tragedy? For some, Kayla became a symbol of resilience, a young woman who fought back against overwhelming odds. For others, her actions represented a dangerous precedent, a cautionary tale about how pain, left unchecked, can spiral into something uncontrollable. As the years passed, the debate continued, but one thing was certain: Kayla's story would not be forgotten. It served as a stark reminder of the complexities of justice, the consequences of betrayal, and the enduring need for empathy and understanding in the face of unimaginable pain. In the end, Dr. Reyes concluded, this isn't just Kayla's story. It's a story about all of us, about the systems we create, the trust we break, and the paths we choose when faced with the unthinkable. It's a lesson we can't afford to ignore. And as the credits roll on this chapter, we're left with a question for ourselves. When does justice become vengeance? And how do we ensure no one else is left to answer that question alone? As Kayla's story comes to an end, the questions it raises linger long after the final chapter. Do you believe her actions were an act of justice, a way of reclaiming the power stolen from her? Or do you see this as a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of how far pain and trauma can push someone when they feel they have no other options? We want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this case? Was there a point where things could have been different? Could someone have stepped in to change the course of events? Share your theories and opinions in the comments below. Your voice matters in these discussions. For context, if you or someone you know is experiencing abuse, remember that you are not alone. There are resources and people ready to help. Reach out to local authorities, trusted community members, or confidential hotlines for support. No one should have to face such pain in silence. If you haven't already, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell. Your support is crucial as it helps us continue to bring you compelling stories filled with betrayal, deceit, and crime, just like the one you've heard today. Stay tuned for more deep dives into complex narratives that reveal the darker sides of human nature and the redemptive power of truth and resilience. Don't miss out on our upcoming episodes. Subscribe now and join us as we explore more intriguing and thought-provoking stories. Thank you for your support.